أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillahi. So we're going to be talking about why history is important for Muslims. And we have Ustad Hamza with us, a dear friend and brother of mine. So we were just waiting for him to tune in. His expertise and focus is on history. And he did work in Islamic studies and history at the University of Chicago. And this is a field that he loves. So we're just waiting for him to come on. Let me try to see if I can bring him on. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillahi. We have our brother, Ustad, the Sheikh Hamza. Can you give a little bit about your background?
So I converted to Islam in 2010, and shortly thereafter I began studying at the Islamic University of Minnesota with Sheikh Walid al-Manisi, and I went into their graduate master's program, and then eventually found my way doing a master's degree at the University of Chicago as well in Islamic history.
So we're going to take on this topic of why it is important for Muslims to understand history. And, I wanted this platform to be for you. So let's, you take it from there, and we can continue, dialoguing throughout when you're ready.
Well, I have just some questions that can just get us kind of started that we can just freely talk about. But the first one is, how does history fit into the traditional Islamic sciences, or ulum ad-din, or whatever you want to call it?
So you want to start off with that question?
I mean, from my humble, meager understanding, the way I understand it is that tarikh, or history, has always been considered an Islamic science, just like usul al-hadith, or aqidah, or tafsir, or what have you. I feel it's often neglected in recent times. But one exemplar that we can look at in the medieval history is Imam al-Tabari, or Jarir al-Tabari. He had his own madhab called the Jariri madhab that died out, and he has his famous book, Tarikh al-Tabari, and his famous tafsir and those types of things. And it just goes to show you how the ulama of old were very much into history and thought it was extremely important.
There's also, if you permit me to add, Sheikh, there is another angle as well, which has a lot to do with the nature of revelation and the identity of the ummah. Islam has been with human beings since the beginning of the creation, from the angle of Adam alayhi salatu wasalam being our primordial father. He came into time and space. Allah created him in time and space. And so Islam was, something that was transmitted from on high to our father Adam, continued to be transmitted to the prophets. But when we look at the reality of the revelation of the Quran, let me see. When we look at the revelation of the Quran came to us at a particular historical time period. And it came to speak to a particular historical situation that the community of target which was basically the Prophet and his companions, they lived in. But at the same time, the Quran also speaks universally to every time period. And we say Islamu salihun li kulli makan wa zaman. That Islam is, viable, it's adaptable, it's relatable to every time period in every place where human beings live in, or every contextual reality. So that's the first thing, that the Quran, one of the most important things is the Quran comes and speaks to the time period and to people's situation that's very historical. The other thing is that the Quran itself swears by time. Wal asr innal insana fi khusr, so on and so forth. And the Quran is a series of examples of the prophets and the nations that came before alayhi salam. And then the other issue is that we were extremely conscious of history as an ummah from two angles. The prophetic life was detailed, from the beginning of his birth to his death. The only prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, that we know of with regard to his life from beginning to end in detail is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So very historically conscious community in that regard. And the other thing is that this ummah is rooted in the Hijri calendar. It is marked a historical marking period. So we're very historically conscious. We have lost that. And this is probably, and I don't want to hog the mic, but this is probably why a lot of times nowadays we're irrelevant in our discourse, because we're not historically conscious. We're thinking only in universal principles, but we're forgetting that history is about understanding your story as well, and and where you fit at in time and place, and how to benefit from others.
Yeah, in a sense, the Quran, the ahadith or seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, it's historically situated in one sense. And I feel like when you understand the history of that time period well, it helps you to understand the general principles that are being taught. When you understand, okay, what did this animal mean in Arab culture, for instance? And then there's hadith
Yes,
about that animal, and you go, oh, okay, I see what they're trying to say now, for example.
that is a reality, that when even to support your point, when you look at the Arabic language, one of the thing that distinguishes the Arabic language from Sanskrit or Latin is the fact that it was codified, and we can see its usage in time and place, and we can take that root system back to that historical context, so we know what the root words mean, but also the usage. You know what I'm saying? And so any which way you look, you mentioned the any which way you look, you're gonna see and find history. And you mentioned the point of the historian, scholar, of hadith as well, at-Tabari and others like Imam Ibn Khaldun. And the scholars of hadith also, they had their own conceptualization of how history is to be employed in the study of the Sunnah, which is very much different than how they dealt with history with regard to chronicling the events that took place in the world.
Yeah, it's a
The
different
usage of
epistemology.
history was completely different. So I don't think that, I think that we have laid down a foundation in, within the reasonableness of this setting and platform, that history is essential to revelation and Islamic sciences, and also the contribution of the thinking on civilization that came from the Muslims within the context, of Islamic scholarship.
Yeah, that word context is where I see history coming in, because when you want to talk about al-wahy or revelation, the Quran, the ahadith, I think the ulama, the early Islamic scholars, they knew right away that history was important to understanding revelation, and that's why you have this whole science they call asbab and nuzul, right?
Yes.
Explaining, why certain verses were revealed, or what was their historical context when they were revealed. And when you look at the commentaries like Fath al-Bari on, Sahih Bukhari, it'll explain the historical context of certain hadith and what they're about and what they mean.
Yep. Yep. That is the that is one of the aspects of where there's an inseparability of the discipline or the study of history from the study of revelation in and of itself. That when we start talking about the asbab al-nuzul, and the asbab al-nuzul, alhamdulillah, in this time period, within the last couple hundred years, there's been a lot of discussion on the whole concept of asbab al-nuzul, or the occasions in which the Quran is revealed. And we know that it's not always just for a particular, situation, and that's where we get principles like al-ibra bi umum al-lafz wa laysa bi khusus al-sabab, that when we look at an ayat may have been revealed and it was speaking to a particular person or situation, but we take the general import or meaning of it and we just don't stay stuck on, okay, the Quran came and it was addressed to this situation. But knowing that the Quran came and it was addressed to this situation allows us to be able to make sound tafsir. What are so you began with your first question. So what are other venues that we can look at, with regard to the study
So
of history?
for me, one of the things that I've always thought about, starting in like a traditional, Arab madrasa, where I, sat and learned the Islamic text, mutun, these fundamental texts that we all study. And then when I started getting much more of a grasp of Islamic history, I felt that it helped me to understand these texts much better, that I could understand what they were saying in their historical context. And it brings me back to this idea of, using history in order to understand ayat of Quran or different ahadith, and even texts that were written by ulama later on, like, Al-Aqidah Tahawiyah from Imam Tahawi, or, so on and so forth. If we understand their socio-political realities during the time in which they lived, can that help us to understand these texts better?
You bring up a point. Unfortunately, Islamic studies in the West does not have the maturity that we, and I'm talking about internally within the Muslim community. I'm not necessarily including aspects of Islamic study which are taken up in the university system. In here specifically, I mean in the Western university system. But one of the things that we see with Islamic studies overseas is that when we start talking about texts, whether it's in the science of the Quran, whether it's in tasawwuf, whether it's in philosophy, whether it's in hadith, whether it's in poetry, mathematics, language, whatever it may be, you find that a lot of times they're looking at the historical dimension. When they introduce that text and they make it ready for being published and put into the market for readership consumption, they talk about the history of the authors, they talk about the
Yep.
geography, they talk about all of that, which is very akin to what you guys do in the university system.
Yep.
But the unfortunate part of the general body of the Muslim community is that type of consciousness is not there. So that sensitivity to the importance of understanding history and its role and how that gives you an insight into a body of knowledge is missing from the general Muslim community, right? Is missing from the general Muslim community. And we're talking about Islam like it's ahistorical. So people begin to think about the time of the Sahaba like it's a reality right now, and ignoring
Right.
everything that took place for 1400 years, and even what ourselves, like we are not historically conscious of even ourselves, like what
Mm-hmm.
is our role in this time period, like what are the characteristics of this historical moment, because Allah doesn't make mistakes. Allah created time and Allah created us in this time period, but that historical consciousness that you see is so much a part of the methodology of scholarship, whether it's in Azhari Sharif or whether it's in the University of Chicago. History is being employed as a tool to understand certain realities. As a matter of fact, we even have Imam Ibn Khaldun, who was the one who laid down the foundation for a lot of what goes on in the West as
Yep.
far as thinking. Imam Ibn Khaldun, in his introduction to history, which became known as the Muqaddimah of Imam Ibn Khaldun, which was his introduction to his massive work on history, the types of sciences that went into that book to research history, it took multiple departments in the West: anthropology, economics, political science, history, sociology, psychology. It took all of those different disciplines to explain history, and these are all of the disciplines which are missing from our studies as Muslims. Like, we have people studying Islam, but these are the disciplines that are missing from the thinking of the Muslims when it comes to the issue of understanding reality and how to apply Islam, and even how to deal with the text. So how do you make sense of the fact that that's so much an essential part of Islamic studies, but it's missing from our community's thinking and the repertoire or the tools that we rely on? Like, how do we even deal with that, and how do we make
Yeah.
sense of that gap in our knowledge?
The way I look at that is there's an academic, his name is William Chittick, and he's a Muslim convert and expert on the history of Sufism. And he wrote a book where he talks about historical methodology and science of the cosmos, science of the soul, I think is what it's called. And in it, he details kind of the difference between the Western way of looking at knowledge and the Islamic way.
Oh yeah, that was the last book that he wrote, right?
I believe
It's a
so.
it was a smaller book. It was supposed to be
Yep.
like his masterpiece
It's
work.
like $10.
Yeah.
Very small. But it's very impactful. And he puts this distinction between how Muslims look at knowledge and how the West looks at knowledge. And the word that he uses for the West is takthir, to make more of something, to make it kathir, a lot, right? Takthir. In contradistinction to tawheed, to make one, right? To have oneness and a holistic kind of way of doing things. And so the West has always been obsessed with breaking things down into smaller digestible pieces and analyzing that, making it abstract and so on and so forth. Whereas you could see with Ibn Khaldun, what did he do with all of the ulum out there? He did tawheed, he put them together, right? And he looked at,
Interdisciplinary still, yeah.
exactly, interdisciplinary, and he looked at it holistically. And Muslims, I think, throughout the whole medieval period, al-Usur al-Wusta, that's what they were doing. And it wasn't until, I think, Napoleon invaded Egypt and brought all his Orientalists, there was kind of a sudden epistemological shock to the Muslim world. And we were shocked because the military came onto our shores. The Ottoman Empire in the 1800s and 1700s even was losing a lot of territory. They went all the way, punched their way to Austria. And then after that, they're slowly shrinking. Russia was coming at them through the Caucasian mountains. Europe was coming at them. Spain was lost, and they saw these people as somehow being superior because of military and technology. And they said, okay, well, let's send the best of ours over to their universities, study something, and bring that back. We can use that to fight them. That was kind of the mentality. And in a way, it backfired. It caused epistemological, or you might just say it caused intellectual colonization before the real colonization actually came. And so then the takfir came into the Muslim way of thinking, where you have to compartmentalize everything into little boxes. This is this field, this is that field. I'm going to hyper focus on this spot. Do a PhD dissertation on this one little very specific thing. And we lost that kind of Khaldunian way of thinking.
Yeah, the concept of the polymath that was so, emblematic of the scholarship of the past is almost completely gone now, because, I remember, like, I wanted to do graduate studies at Miami University in Ohio, and they have a pretty nice education program. And the reason why I wanted to do it in education was because they have an interdisciplinary track. When I talked to the head of the department. She was really cool, really nice, really reasonable, thoughtful. She was actually from Detroit, and she had saw that I was living in Detroit one time. So she was like, "You're from the D." All of this, that environment of connected was there. And then when it came down to the question of, can I do it, interdisciplinary, thesis, she was like, "Our department, I know we have it on paper, but our department is not there." You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? So most of education nowadays, that's where it's at. Unfortunately, a lot of us don't know that the past, the Muslims they had a diversified, I wouldn't say liberal education the way we understand it in the concept of liberal today, but the concept of liberal education back then it was well rounded.
Yes,
It was
very.
and so a person like Hafid ibn Hajar, he was exposed to all of the disciplines, rahmatullahi alayh, but then he became known for his expertise in hadith after he was well rounded.
Yep,
You know what I'm
exactly.
saying? And we've lost that concept of well-roundedness. That's why our scholarship today sometimes has a lot of difficulty in dealing with issues, whether cultural issues or political issues or technical issues or even dealing with gray areas, because the thinking of the people is not a well-rounded thinking. It's not a scholarship which is well-rounded in all of the disciplines and understands their interconnections. There was a scholar in Egypt of hadith, Sheikh Mamdouh, and he was very critical of Sheikh Al-Albani. And he used to state a statement amongst uh, that was known amongst the scholars. He was like, Sahib al-Funun aqwa min Sahib al-Fan. The scholar who's
Yeah.
multidisciplinary and has multiple subjects under their belt of mastery is, stronger than the scholar that's just focused on one thing and is not really focused in the interdisciplinary way. And even, we love Sheikh Al Albani and others, but that's just the reality, rahmatullahi alayhi. That's just the reality that we have to come to conclude that really our scholarship is interdisciplinary, and really one of the only places which puts a lot of attention on historical studies has been Nadwat al Ulama, in India, where we have people like Abu Hassan and Nadwi and others that was a fundamental part of their curriculum, the study of history. When Muhammad Abdu tried to introduce the Muqaddimah back to Azhar al-Sharif, because they weren't reading stuff like that at Azhar, they were just focusing on Ashari Aqidah and Tasawwuf and Madhabi Fiqh, and they were strong in those things in the recital of the Quran and so on and so forth, and Hadith and Arabic language. But they almost considered him to be, Sheikh Ali considered to be like a deviant. Like, why are you bringing Ibn Khaldun into the masjid? To read the Muqaddimah.
That's so strange to
And
me.
the irony of it is that they began to take onto the Muqaddimah again when they found that the Western world was reading Ibn
Right.
Khaldun. Then all of a sudden they come and they imitate what the West is doing, and they're learning their own tradition. And so that all that long breathness on my part is to say that actually what you're bringing back to us right now and the importance is not necessarily a Western phenomenon, but you're making us reflect upon who we were. We were an ummah that saw the importance of the study of history. What are, let me throw this question to you. What are some of the main priorities that we should have in the study of history for ourselves? And what will be the benefit right now for us to begin serious historical studies?
I mean, I feel like a lot of Muslims are very excited that I see here in America, very excited to read Sirah, very excited to read the biographies of the Sahaba, Khulafa Rashideen, and all of those things, which is great. But then it just kind of stops there. And some, may be interested in reading biographies of the famous scholars and things like that, or like tabaqat type literature, different biographies of different scholars. Um, but they might be interested maybe in learning a little bit about who were the Abbasids, who were the Umayyads, and things like that. But I feel like it's very kind of limited in its scope.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when they think of Islamic history, they think of like something 1,000 years ago or the medieval period, and they just forget that the past 200 years is also Islamic history.
Yes.
How we dealt with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, colonization, all those things is part of Islamic history. The past 30 years are part of Islamic history. What's happened, since the early 90s until now is Islamic history too. What's going on in Syria is Islamic history too.
The wiping off of Palestine off of the map.
Yo, yo. Yeah, I mean the whole Sykes-Picot thing, that's a whole can of worms I don't want to open up right now. But I think the overall benefit is to know, especially like sociological type data about the Muslim world in the past, or economic data, or the political kind of structures that existed. It kind of gives us different ways of being than what we see today. It also helps us understand that maybe some of the problems we think are just limited to our current times always existed. Or, that for the most part, I think we kind of mythologize our past instead of just looking at kind of the stark realities of what was going on sometimes. And I think coming to terms with that helps us to feel a little bit better about ourselves, if you will, or help us to kind of better maybe understand our own identity as a ummah, our own Muslim identity. Because history is part of identity, where you come from, who you are. And I think that's why the Arabs, they write about it a lot more, having their introductions in all the Arabic books about historical facts, because they're proud of their history.
The Quran says, "قُلْ سِرُّوا فِي الْأَرْضِ ثُمَّ انظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ." And there's another ayat that it says to the effect, كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ. And you begin to see that the Quran is saying, basically, be a tourist in the world, travel in the world, and pay attention to the outcome of those who have professed kufr or they lied, the nations that came before you. And that opens up all kinds of things like archaeology and anthropology, and historical studies on multiple levels. The study of the rise and fall of civilization, which was an important topic for Imam Ibn Khaldun, which is an important topic for us right now with all these changes in the world, what's going on with empires and so on and so forth. But also the Quran, was telling us, to commanding us to also travel and see what was the outcome of those who were, violators, not only of the deen, of the rights of people, and historically, when we look at different situations, we can kind of get an understanding of what is a good trajectory for a nation, what is a good trajectory for a people that wants to revive itself. Like, for instance, the Polish people, what kept them together for so long was their grasp of the language, the Polish language, and their sticking to it. It was a form of resistance.
Yeah.
And so you learn so many things from different communities and different peoples, not just the Muslims, but all kinds of communities. And that's what led the Muslims to study everything. The Muslims were studying everything. Matter of fact, we have Muslims that just kicked it and they traveled the world, and we're just
Yeah.
like, who are you guys? Like, tell us about yourself,
Ibn
about
Battuta.
your food. And yeah, the Ibn Battuta type of mindset. We were literally, some people may get mad at me, but we were kind of like liberal hippies, just going to every community and sitting is like, well, let me chill out and hang out with you guys and learn about you.
That's
But
right.
the Quran, no doubt, gives us a premise, a principle that we should be studying history to understand how not to make the same mistakes of those that came before, and we should get some benefit from it for our here and now and then the hereafter. A lot of this is for the hereafter because a lot of it has to do with the fact that we should know what a community looks like of Iman and what are some of the successes that communities of Iman have had and what is their downfall. But it just seems that we, are absent-minded, we're forgetful, we're not learning about the past. You know what I'm saying? And so it seems like we're falling into the same mistakes as before. How could we even have a concept of revival of the deen and establishment of the deen without history? Is it possible?
I don't think so personally. I mean, like, if you want to talk about revival and talk about this idea of, the separation between takfir and tawheed, we have this famous book in our tradition, Ihya Ulum al-Din. Wasn't Ihya, al-Hadith, no, it was Ulum al-Din, all the different sciences, revival of the sciences of deen. And even though, there's not like an explicit chapter like, oh, on history, this is Tariq, this is what happened to the Umayyads or anything like that, but what Ghazali does is he builds on all previous scholarship. He's looking at everything that was written before him in many different genres of Islamic, thought, and he's quoting people in the past. He might not say their name, but he would be having block quotes from different people in his book. One of the famous books that he copies from is Qut al-Qulub. Okay, and I wrote an article how he borrowed a lot from Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, an earlier scholar. So I mean, it's reflected all throughout the book, in my opinion. And I think what you mentioned about Muslims traveling and seeing all different kinds of peoples and learning different cultures. We have historical writings of Muslims who encountered the Vikings, Muslims who encountered the Hindus before Islam ever came to India, and all of these types of things. And I think it's a good segue into how can history help us be more empathetic to other human beings.
It's funny that you mentioned the whole thing, the whole thing of Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, and how he built off of the works of others. That's something that has been lost in today's time. And Imam Ibn Khaldun, one of the 7 logics that he talks about when it comes to the issue of how we deal with knowledge, one of the things that he talked about was basically building off of what others have, started. They lay down a foundation, so you expand on it, or you clarify what they have said, or you add on to it, in a very specific way. Like, for instance, from another science, you come and you bring it in. In the concept of expanding, you're building out something that was already said, but in the concept of bringing a new relationship to it, you bring it, you're constructing knowledge in a new way. Sometimes there is refutation that's necessary. You know what I'm saying? But he talked about sometimes, like you said, that Imam al-Ghazali took from here and there, and he brought things together, different branches of knowledge, different insights, so that we can revive the deen overall. And so one of the things that is important to understand is that we Muslims, if we don't understand what came before, if we don't understand the contributions that came before, if we don't understand the different challenges that Muslims have gone through, the civilizational contributions, the different sciences that came before us, the way that we used to live, all of that, if we can't build off of the past, we won't move forward as a Muslim ummah. We have to build on the past. But a culture of refutation solely is not going to allow us to be able to move forward. Because like what you were mentioning, Imam al-Ghazali's masterpiece in the Ihya was the fact that he was able to synergize and synchronize all different branches of knowledge and bring it forward in such a way that the posterity, those generations that came after him, they had something to work with. And some scholars have even said that if my whole library were to be lost, I could rebuild all of the sciences of the Ummah from the Ihya. All of the knowledge of the Ummah, I can build it from the Ihya. That was a concept that some scholars have put forward. Because we don't understand history, like we don't understand that Al-Andalus collapsed because the Muslims were constantly going at each other's throats, and they began to fight each other, literally fight each other, ally against each other, undermine each other. And
All
this
the
is one
different
of the ways,
city-states.
yes, that's one of the ways that, Islamic civilization took a final blow before the Ottomans collapsed. And so, but all of that knowledge that was there, mathematics and geography and geometry and architecture and language, and horticulture and chemistry, Everything that was there is disappeared. Al-Andalus is missing from the map of humanity. It does not exist anymore. You know what I'm saying? But what remained was their knowledge. The knowledge was continued to move forward, but that knowledge as a live example is gone.
Yeah.
We are not building off of each other. It's okay if we have mistakes. You know what I'm saying? We can correct it. Somebody may have a serious mistake, but that doesn't mean everything that they have is to be thrown out.
كل ابن
And so
آدم
we,
خطأ.
yes, and so we're not, we don't, as far as what you were saying, that historical example, we're not learning from history, and neither are we building off of each other, right? Neither are we building off of each other. So, what would you say, like for instance, when it comes to fiqh, when it comes to things like tariq al-tashri', what's the benefit of history, of knowing history? In terms of fiqh, do you think, or do you have a position on that?
I mean, it's hard to know where to begin with that question. It's so big. I could talk about it, for a long time, or think about it in a lot of different ways. But I think it's important to know, like, when I was talking about Imam Ghazali, one of the things that I thought about right away was how he revolutionized the Shafi'i madhab. And not only was he was a famous, usuli in the, legal theory, legal theoretician, but he was also expert in, the furu' al-fiqh, or, you might call it the positive law, or the actual, hard rules, or whatever you want to call it. He changed some of those and had his own opinions and differed with scholars that came before him. He, revolutionized usul fiqh by adding some certain things from philosophy that were beneficial, that didn't contradict Islam. And he made it, you might say, more coherent, or more detailed, or in-depth. And, when you look at all the different four madhahib, they had various giant figures, big scholars, who came and they made a whole shift in the madhab. You might say Qarafi for the Malikis. You might say, we think of more examples, Ghazali for the Shafi'is. For the Hanafis, you might say the author of Al-Hidayah al-Marghinani, and different things like this. And it's also, history is also important, not because understanding how a madhab can shift, or the debates in between a madhab or different madhahib, but also understanding that the fatwas they gave and the texts that they wrote about Islamic law had a lot to do with the political realities of their time, the cultural, sociological realities of their time. You look at some earlier Islamic texts, they don't, like legal texts in particular, like in the Hanbali madhab, for example, if you look at Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi, the legal language isn't that codified. You don't see mustahab, you see like istishab and kind of like other forms of it, and it's not so uniform. And you see the development and codification of language and thought and all these things that kind of gives you, I guess, a bigger perspective on how people write now. And it gives you a bigger perspective on how, you might say, muftis should make fatawa now.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the past and how historically situated these, this particular fatwa collection is, and then you can look and think now, okay, well, how are we historically situated now? How are we different from back then? How does that affect the way I might write a certain fatwa? Because things aren't the same now as they were before. I think everybody can acknowledge that.
Bilal is talking to us a lot about how do we build the community. I want to pause on that type of concept for a second, but I want to get to something which may bring me some criticism, but I think it's very important. If we look at history, and we look at the history of the Muslim community, and I'm asking you because I consider you to be my brother and, contemporary and teacher, but also, you're a historian. You love history. And when you look at Islam as a civilization. And I'm not talking about just Islamic practice, but Islam as a cultural reality manifested. Do you think the role of women today is equivalent to what the role of women was 300 to 400 years ago, or even in the time of the Sahabiyat, as far as their contributions and everything? Because the Muslim community is seriously having an issue with this question in the midst of feminism and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? We're really struggling with this.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get irritated with a lot of, I guess you might say, lay Muslims. And I consider myself a lay Muslim, but like, there's this idea that any attack on, gender relations or trying to reformulate it or rethink it automatically means you're a feminist or you're poisoned by Western scholarship or Western feminism. When really we could look back at our own historical tradition and know, I mean, I think it's pretty fairly universally understood, maybe I'm wrong about that, that Muslim women had a much more prominent role in society before the modern period. And they had massive influence even in the caliphal court. They had a massive role in community building. Many of them were merchants and well known in their cities and towns, and all different kinds of professions that they used to do in all different kinds of ways they used to build community. And I think,
Yeah, like build one of the top universities in the world.
yeah, I mean, arguably the oldest
like
university.
Zaytuna University. I mean, Qairawan, is one of those places which is, it was built by a woman. Pretty much her money and even the issue of scholarship. To be honest with you, you know what I'm saying. The issue of scholarship of women in the past is way more dominant than what it is today.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
We're listening to opinions that are like ultimately backward, like women should not study.
Yeah.
And yet, when you look at the ijazat, when you look at even the work that Dr. Akram Nadwi did on women and the science of hadith, people critique that. They said, well, she really wasn't a big role. But when we look back, if we look back solidly, we're going to see that women were playing major roles in all kinds of branches of knowledge. And matter of fact, there was I forget her last name. If it was a Shetty, I forget. Dr. Aisha, forget her name incomplete right now, but she was recent. She was a scholar of hadith. She's known for her version of the Muqaddimah in the science of hadith by Ibn Salah. She has her own critical edition of it from Egypt. Her father wanted to keep her in a certain position. She was a scholar of Azhar, and she literally disobeyed him and became a scholar in the deen. You know what I'm saying? And she became a scholar in the deen and became known in tafsir and hadith. You see what I'm saying? And so it's like what we're doing now, it seems like we're not learning from history. We're not learning the role that Aisha had being in the deen versus the role of the women of Jahiliyyah. You understand what I'm saying? The role that Aisha had was so extremely powerful, radiallahu anha, that she was not only a relator of hadith, but she was a person of understanding and fiqh and communicating insights into the Quran. And she even became, a leader and even raised the army. People can jump all over the place, all over all what they want. But that's the type of people that Islam was building, right? Those are the types of people that Islam was building, that they were strong. And it just seems like historically we're distorting Islam. You know what I'm saying? We want a certain type of understanding of the role of men and women because we're not comfortable with where things are that may be not necessarily healthy for us.
We just want to mythologize the past to fit whatever our feelings or inclinations may be. That's what I was kind of alluding to earlier. We don't want to sit there and face the facts, even if the facts might not be a perfect, pure image. We had female sultanas that ruled politically in Islamic history. That's a fact. How do we What do we make of that? What do we think about it? You know, there's nobody really talking about it. You know, I mean, here in Minnesota, alhamdulillah, we have a very prominent, you know, female scholar of Islam,
Yeah.
Sheikh Tamara Gray, who studied in Syria for 20 years. And she talks about this stuff. She's way more qualified than me to talk about it. She knows much more about it, the topic, than I do. She has her own Islamic, you know, bookstore here in Minnesota where she has a lot of books about those topics. But it's definitely a reality that we, as Muslims, tend to romanticize the past in ways that might be unhealthy.
You know, going back to the issue of the study of fiqh and history, I remember when I first, you know, in Al Azhar, I have a teacher from Al Azhar, Sheikh Ahmed Sabalik. He's one of the senior scholars of Al Azhar. They call it the Scholars Front, Jabhatul Ulama Al Azhar, and that, you know, they were no joke on the political level and on, you know, multiple levels. But one of the things that he had advised for students of knowledge, which is very unique, he said, if you want to study the history of every science first. History of the Quran, history of Hadith, history of Aqidah, history of the Arabic language, history of fiqh, history of usul al-fiqh, so on and so forth, and see how these things developed. And when you start talking about the history of fiqh, which is supposed to be the science which is teaching us of how to extract from the Quran and the Sunnah knowledge of the halal and the haram with regard to our actions. But when you read the history of fiqh, you see the development of how that began in the time period of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how it developed in the time period of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the Tabi'een, and so on and so forth till today's time, right? We even see how in the Ottoman Empire, how their attempt to imitate the non-Muslims and codify
make
the legal
qanun.
system, how it basically displaced the scholars, right? And Noah Feldman, the Harvard-trained lawyer, you know, he wrote a book about, you know, the Islamic State, and basically in that book, he talked about how that actually had a negative impact, right? What is that? Yes. That I saw that listed. The second let me read it
formation
because
of Islamic law, the
the
Hanafi
second
school, and the
formation of
early
Islamic
modern
law.
empire. So he details that whole thing, you know, in this book, that whole phenomenon.
And who's the author?
Guy Burak.
And see, these are the types of things that unfortunately we're not finding that we're studying. A lot of the people that are doing this are the non-Muslims. Some of us are doing it, but a lot of the work is being done by non-Muslims, right? But when you look at the history of fiqh overall in all of its different time periods, and you come down and you see how the scholars were displaced even in the, you know, latest rendition of the Ottoman Empire. You know, when they tried to bring in a legal system that's similar to the West, they really displaced a lot of the scholars. And that continued, and it still continues to today's time. And it's part of the crisis that we have in the Muslim community today. Why imams and scholars are really not forefront on the, you know, on the map on a lot of things, right? And so we, you know, we don't understand also the flexibility of fiqh, and overall we just are not understanding. To go to Bilal's question about community, part of the issue is that, you know, we're not understanding how to be relevant to our own time period, because we think that certain things are set in stone where they're not. They're flexible, right? But it takes a certain amount of Islamic scholarship to be able to understand how to apply the knowledge of Islam. It's not just a free-for-all. Some people, they think things are a free-for-all, right? And then other people think that things are just set in stone. So we're literally stuck between a conservative trend and a semi-liberal trend, but it's not of our own doing. You understand what I'm saying? We have gotten to this place because of the historical trajectory. In other words, the Muslims went on a decline, and we're continuing on the decline, and we have to come back to that point of how do we revive? And part of how we can revive is by studying history. You know, by studying history, some of the ulama, they said the sunanullah, that's what we learn from history. right? Sunan Allah, the Sunan of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. We learn the patterns of the rise and fall of civilization, and we learn the patterns of what are the rules of success, and we can learn more so the patterns of how to revive the deen. And that has been talked about by the scholars overall. What would you say is the importance of history in the study of Aqidah?
I mean, I think the study of history is important for every Islamic science, kind of like you were mentioning the scholars of Azhar saying, but also when it comes to Aqidah in particular, you know, maybe an average Muslim might pick up some sort of Aqidah text of some kind, and you'll constantly see references to other groups. You have the Jahmiyyah, you have maybe the Karramiyya, or all of these different groups, you know, the Ash'ira or Atharis or what have you, and you don't know who they are or what they professed or what they said, and therefore you don't really know what they're referencing or what they're talking about. And so that is kind of that was frustrating for me. I remember personally when I started reading these texts. And then also now when I go reread the basic text that I was taught many years ago, like Al-Aqidah Tahawiyya, I can understand, okay, this point, he's indirectly referencing this group and just not explicitly saying it. Okay? For instance, why is al-mash al-khufayn,
In Aqidah.
wiping over the leather socks, why is that a matter of Aqidah? Well, it has to do with refuting other groups. You know, all the ahadith about wiping over the khuf are considered mutawatir, mass transmitted. People from different geographical locations transmitted it on such a mass scale, there's no way they could have all conspired to make it up. And yet, everybody except Sunnis reject that. The Khawarij rejected it. The modern iteration, the Ibadis reject it. The Shia, the Ismailis, the Ithna Ashriya, the Seveners and Twelvers, even some of the Fivers, they reject it. So that goes to tell you that, knowing these kind of historical phenomena can help you a lot. And also for me, when it came to understanding not only just like Aqidah or the Athari creed, but also if you want to try to understand what is Kalam and why is it so controversial, you have to look at all the different groups that existed over time, the Mu'tazila, Jahmiyyah, the Murji'ah, and all these different groups. And it helps put in context what the Athari creed is, or the Ash'ari or Maturidi creeds, or all these different things that Sunnis claim. It puts them in context that, these are actually kind of like the middle way. These ones were kind of the extreme, like deviated ways, and their deviation or extremeness, you might say, is obvious, That's why sometimes they're referred to as the ghulat, like extremists or whatever you want to call it. So I think it's important in that aspect. And, you have like the Oxford Handbook to Islamic Theology. You have this one from Cambridge too that's smaller, that people can go and get a basic look at. Or you have the Maqalat from, Ash'ari too, that kind of details a lot of these early groups. And you have the story of Hassan al-Basri and the Mu'tazila. Why do they have this name? Because they made i'tizal, like a retreat, from the circles of the Sunnis and professed their own thing. And it had to do about the sinner, what was it? Al-munzila bain al-munzilatayn, right? A grave sinner, is he considered a kafir or is he still a believer? A lot of the Khawarij would say, no, he's a kafir. The Mu'tazila said he kind of is in this in-between position. And the Sunnis will say, well, he's a believer, he's just not a good one, more or less. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but, understanding history helps us to understand what's going on with all that. And what did these different groups, what were they doing politically? The Khawarij were slaughtering people left and right. The Mu'tazila were very, very close with the Abbasid caliphs and trying to do a Mahna inquisition, saying that the Quran was created and all these different things. All those factors, they all come together to give you a more holistic picture.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah. What would you say then, is the way forward for us. You know, from some of these discussions that we had, you know, we've had a overall discussion, but there's been little discussions, sub discussions with regard to history and so on and so forth. What do you suggest? You know, how should we approach the whole issue of history for ourselves in a simple way? You know, so that we can begin to develop a historical consciousness. And you know, and aside from historical consciousness, what should we be trying to do by the study of history? You know, what should we be aiming at?
So, I've created a YouTube channel called Hamza the Historian, and I recently made a video. It's just how to study history, how to study Islamic history, rather. And I kind of just detail some basic books that you could get a grasp and get started and get a kind of basic foundational knowledge. And I think for Muslims, for us studying our own history, it goes back to this whole idea of colonization and the decline of our political power and all of these things. We've become intellectually colonized in so many ways from the West. And many Muslims, because they don't understand Western thought at all, they don't understand what the Enlightenment is or what modernity means in a philosophical sense or what classical liberalism is, they fail to understand how it's crept into their way of thinking. And they use these ways of thinking and approaching Islamic texts, even shuyukh and ulama sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it distorts the deen from within, in a sense. It's kind of a really scary thought. And I took a class that was called Islam in Modern Science at the University of Chicago that was taught by an anthropology professor, Ali Reza Dostar. And it kind of made me super depressed because the whole class was about how Western ways of thinking kind of crept into Islamic ways of thinking and replaced, just utterly replaced our indigenous Islamic epistemologies, our own ways of thinking about the world and the universe. Our whole worldview became distorted in a sense. And then you have these old tafsirs sitting there collecting dust, saying, oh, this is the Quranic verse where it argues that the earth is flat. And you're just kind of like, wow, did that really happen? There's a scientific tafsir, kind of like what Zakir Naik does nowadays, with information we consider as unscientific now. And if we want to try to recover from colonization, we have to go back to the past and do like a genealogy of our thought. We have to reconnect with our
What does that
medieval
mean?
tradition.
What does that mean, a genealogy of our thought?
We have to look at how our trajectory of thought has changed over time, and you'll notice a very abrupt, sudden break when colonization happens. When Napoleon invades Egypt, there's a very sudden shift and break in the way of thinking. You see it even in fiqh texts. So over here, this is the oldest extant legal text that we know of, the Kitab al-Asl from Muhammad Shaybani, the student of Abu Hanifa. Below me is 18th century text, Hashiyat ibn Abidin. Okay, so this is like the polar opposites on the timeline, right? Hashiyat ibn Abidin, he's the first person I ever seen. All of a sudden, in the chapter on the Khufayn, he talks about modern shoes and wiping over modern shoes. He says, well, there's people in Samarkand, they add like this bandage thing around their ankles above the shoe, and then they allow, over the shoe like a khuf. So you get these kind of things, and you kind of go, whoa, that's like really kind of a sudden break from all the earlier legal texts. Now they're talking about a whole entirely new phenomenon. Where'd that come from? And so that's just kind of like one little small example. But by going back to the medieval tradition and reconnecting with it, I feel like and also we have to study Western thought. We have to study Orientalism. We have to study the Enlightenment in order to kind of be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to say. We have to be able to get these things out that are dangerous for us. And we can take from it what's beneficial for us, too. And that's a way for us to kind of rethink our situation, rethink our identity, rethink our way of thinking, our epistemology.
Habiba Yassin, she was asking, what kind of books I mean, what maybe make some recommendations of things that we can read.
So I have it more detailed in that video, How to Study Islamic History, but I think like there's a very basic book called The Formation of Islam by Jonathan Berkey that gives you kind of just it's a small, short book, gives you a basic outline of Islamic history, both politically and intellectually, kind of just from the time of the Prophet ﷺ all the way until modernity.
Hmm.
And another one that I really like is from Lapidus. He's a
Yeah, I like him
professor
too.
at Berkeley in California there, and he's got a book, History of Islamic Societies. And so both of these scholars, they're non-Muslims, but I don't feel like they're too poisoned by like Orientalism in a very negative way. They don't have like a strong anti-Muslim bias or anything like that, or I wouldn't be recommending them. But they talk about some really interesting factors that I think a lot of maybe indigenous Islamic historians might overlook. Like the one from Lapidus is a sociological history of the Muslim world.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
he's
I love
looking
that stuff. Yep.
a lot at what culturally actually took place.
Yep.
You know, what were women doing in, 10th century Baghdad? How were they living their lives? You know, and what role did women have in storytelling and literature? It was a massive role. Women were often the childhood teachers of many of our great ulama. Ibn Hazm studied literature and Quran under women. Some of them were even like slave women.
Yep.
And that's why he's considered to this day, even by secular Arabs, a great scholar of literature.
As a matter of fact, Imam al-Baji, who was poorer than Imam Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm was rich. You know, he came from a well-to-do.
Very
He
privileged.
was, he at times even complained about that, because they said that even though Imam Ibn Hazm, his tongue was like a sword. Like if he had to dig into you, he would dig into you. He didn't have any holds barred. But they say that his Arabic was sweet because he had learned Arabic from women. You know, he was trained by women, and so they say his Arabic was, very sweet in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, these are like aspects, I think, of our history that we are just kind of lost touch with. You know, literature used to be considered a core part of being an Islamic scholar, studying
Yes.
Arabic literature. Stories that you might say are irreligious or maybe un-Islamic or secular is the terms we like to use nowadays. Back then, they didn't really have those dichotomies.
Yes.
They're like, this is just a story we can learn lessons from, and it helps us learn Arabic.
And this is something that I had wished, and I had talked about this throughout the day. You know, the whole controversy over cuties, right? Cuties was exploring the whole question of sexuality and youth and all that, and the difference between growing up in kind of a restrictive background versus, a very loose background. And, I had wished that she put that in a story versus put it on, a screen. It would have allowed us to really explore, because the question is really relevant, that she raises of how do you work through that dynamic, that you have two different moral systems, you have two different cultures, you have two different moralities. Really, it's about our identity, because to be honest with you, as a person that converted to Islam, and I came to Islam having studied to be a priest for 2.5 years, and I was religious for a while before going into that. But I had my youth.
We
I
all
grew
did.
up in the U.S. I grew up in the U.S. I did my about it stuff. Not that I'm proud, but I did it. But alhamdulillah, that Allah allowed me at a very early age to also switch from that. So, but coming into Islam, there was a lot of identity struggles.
Yeah.
It took me a couple decades to be comfortable with just being like, I'm Puerto Rican. It took me after over 20 years not to wear a kufi. I was wearing a kufi every day of my life. I would go to work on it. I would fight for rights for it. I had it on my license. I still have it on my license, my passport. I went to the university, was discriminated against in the university system.
Yep.
And 9/11, I got locked up because I had a thobe on. the cops stopped me and they threw me in jail, and they were like, when I'm going into the, to the jail cell, it says you came, you were gone, and now you're locked up here. And there was a picture of bin Laden. You know, not that I did anything criminal. It was just a
Yeah.
discriminatory background, right? A situation that was taking place at that time. So much to the point that I had to get a lawyer, and they ended up dropping everything, and I paid like about $50 for a seatbelt charge, and I was outside of my car. But the point is the thobe issue. I was wearing a thobe. I went through that whole drama for a while, and it was identity struggles.
Mhm.
And so I studied philosophy, I studied sociology, I studied psychology, I studied history, I studied religion. You know what I'm saying? I came up in a family which was extremely strong in Puerto Rican culture. I grew up in a diverse community in Philadelphia, and I still struggle with identity issues. So the youth, I'm saying all that to say that even with all that experience and everything, I was struggling. So what about the youth that they're struggling to those issues? We don't employ literature like you're saying, right?
Yeah.
To even explore our own identities. Like, that was one of the cool things about rap music. It was a story that was being told, ideas that were there. You know what I'm saying? But we don't have any means to do that right now. Where are we exploring identity questions? Where are we exploring our place in the world? Where are we even being reflected? Like, look at Ertuğrul was a masterpiece. I didn't see all of it because I wasn't a fanboy, but the reality of the situation is that it's written in another time period. It's not written in 21st century Minnesota or Chicago or Brooklyn, New York. You know what I'm saying? It's written in another time period. It's like we don't even want to deal with our identity in this time period that we're dealing with right now. So it's almost like we're ahistorical.
Yeah, I mean, even Ertugrul, in my opinion, I mean, it's a historical fiction. We just got to be real. It's a mythologized, past. It's not what actually happened. Ibn Arabi, there's no proof he ever had any contact with any of those people, that's portrayed in the show. Muhyiddin and Arabic. Like a lot of that show, like I watched it for a little while and was interested like everybody else, but eventually I got so kind of irritated by the fiction of it and not enough history in it that it was hard for me to watch and hard for people to see them get so addicted to it and those types of things. Um, I kind of lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
About the whole issue of, like, you talked about literature, right?
Uh-huh.
You talked about the role of literature, as being something that you're working through issues in it. Whether it's the before they had, like, for instance, Omar, he would suggest for the children of the Arabs to be taught Lamiatul Arab, because Lamiatul Arab, it told stories, but it talked about bravery, it talked about adab. And so we don't have those types. Where are our stories? You know what I'm saying? Even
Yeah.
this is historical. We're doing this live, and it's part of our time. We can be creative with it, but we just don't seem to have that creative role where we're just like doing history to explore certain things, right? Using our tools to explore issues, to explore how we can relate to the world, how we can be better people.
Yeah, I mean, in the Arab world, I feel like they're still doing that. They're kind of
Yes,
keeping
they
that
are.
tradition going. And, if there's any minors or children watching, this probably isn't like the best thing to talk about. So, maybe kind of shield them a little bit. But uh, what it, one of my favorite authors to read in regards to all this is Tayyib Saleh. And he's got the Season of Migration to the North, or I think it's called, Mawsum al-Hijra ila Shamal. And because when I watched Cuties, it reminded me of that book, and that's a book written by a Sudani author about uh, Sudan's relationship with colonial Britain, and how even now in quote unquote contemporary times or modern times or whatever you want to call it, you have Sudani people going to Britain and trying to take colonial revenge in subtle ways. They're getting their PhD over there and coming back to Sudan and changing things as well. Um, One book that we read in graduate school was called Lyrics Alley, which was written by Leila Abu Irat, who's a female Sudani author. I think she lives in New York actually now, and she wrote this a book about what it meant to grow up as a Sudani female adolescent, in colonial Sudan. It's a historical fiction, and I think those are, these are in the forms of a modern novel inspired by the West, but they still have that essence from the medieval period of these are edifying stories that can teach us, here and now. Some of them are, meant for adults, like, Tayyib Saleh, Seeds of the Migration to the North. But you also have a book from him, The Wedding of Zayn, which is a more innocent one. I think these are important for us to read nowadays, and we should go to the medieval tradition too and read those kind of edifying stories. I mean, it seems like many of the ulama, if they didn't write them themselves, they encouraged it. But even like Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, he has this book, Muhadarat al-Abrar, which is often neglected. And it's just kind of a collection of all little kind of like edifying stories that edify your character, that teach you, manners, adab and akhlaq, as we term it. It's a type of Islamic ethics, besides Sharia that we have. And, even we have just a lot of short stories in Arabic literature, like Tie the Camel and Trust in Allah. That was a piece of literature that existed. Now it's this famous saying that we all are saying, right? That we might just see quoted in some book by some scholar, right? We don't know really where it comes from. It was an actual story written out. And these types of things. And I think we should still be trying to do this. And I think reading a lot of post-colonial literature from the Muslim world, or anti-colonial, anti-colonial, whatever terms you want to use, looking at like the famous Moroccan philosopher Abdurrahman Taha, for instance, and these types of things, I think we should be producing more literature and movies and film that are kind of reflective of our current situation and our identity, and have some edification too. I mean, Arami is one of those things lately that's been a very controversial show too. We talk about cuties and Arami and all these things lately. Arami, I felt like it had, even though it definitely has its flaws and it portrays things that are fawahish that I don't think we should portray, it also has a lot of edifying points, and it talks a lot about identity and how we can cope as Muslims, young Muslim people growing up. There are benefits to that show. You can fast forward and skip some of the bad stuff, but I think there are benefits to some of that type
That's
of stuff.
what we do with most of the programs that we watch. 21st century Muslims, it's like the remote in hand and zip it. Oh, get it. Oh, oh, we didn't get it. That, I mean, not to be funny, but I'm telling you, like, that is how we do TV, unfortunately. You know what I'm saying? Because we're not producing for ourselves, we're trying to just kind of figure out how to manage, but we make it work. We make it work. So I think that, it's funny because Nana Asma, who was this daughter of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, she did a lot of stuff with stories. She did a lot of stuff with poetry, with stories, and that's how she taught Islam. And somebody was just telling me, one of the sisters who she's in Turkey now, a Latina sister, she was telling me that she studied Arabic and stuff. She was telling me that that's something that's needed, stuff in the children's dimension, to edify them and so on and so forth. And so, I think we have a lot of cultural work to do.
For sure.
Any last thoughts before we shut down and head out?
I mean, for you, having, being an alumnus of Azhar, what are ways that you notice just your traditional shuyukh talk about history or use history or teach history? What are things that they did with history that you learned from or benefited from, valued?
I learned that, one of the things that I went into study with the scholars of Al-Azhar at an interesting time, because of time and place and everything, that it was prior to the Arab Spring, and it was after 9/11, so it was very interesting time historically. One of the things that I learned from them especially is that they utilize history to know how things were developed and to kind of learn how to situate. reality. And so even the way they do tradition is kind of in that way. They look at tradition as something that was formulated over time, and they look at it as something that we plumb to gain experience from. They don't look at it as something that is set in stone, that this is deen. They look at it as a byproduct of Islamic civilization. And so they use history to kind of understand how things developed and how this came to be and how to understand the past, and then always figure out how you situate yourself. This is what I think we're missing. So they use history like that in mostly every discipline, and politics is especially important. I've seen, I had scholars narrate to me about, the development of education in Egypt. Sheikh Abdul Hamid, I don't even know if he's still alive. May Allah bless him. He was a student of Abdul Halim Mahmoud, Sheikh Al-Azhar, and he was a very simple person, Sheikh Abdul Hamid. Sheikh Suhaib Webb has studied with him too. We studied Arabic from him, but he would be able to narrate to me stories of the Arab-Israeli war, narrate stories of how education developed in Egypt and the differences in educational systems. He was able to talk about political leaders, and how they developed. He was able to talk about, dynasties that existed in Egypt. You know what I mean? And he was able to talk about a poet, an Arabic writer, a master of the Arabic languages, historical background, and so on and so forth. And so history is very much a heavy part of how they teach. You know what I'm saying? It's very much integrated, into that whole process. And unfortunately, I don't see that we're doing that. How many people in the Salafi Dawah are able to tell you how the Salafi Dawah developed?
Right.
How many Sufis are willing to tell you that, Ibn Ata'Allah al-Iskandari had a conflict with Ibn Taymiyyah? You know what I'm saying? And they were in Egypt together, Or how can do they tell you that Hafiz ibn Hajar was one of the top scholars of the Azhari Sharif and his role? Or Suyuti went to Timbuktu, you know what I'm saying? Suyuti went to Timbuktu and even wrote things about Timbuktu. So it's just like they use history to understand how things develop and to make sure that we understand that knowledge in Islamic tradition is a human effort. It's not revelation. It's a human effort. With revelation, there's thought. And that gives you a different role and approach to how we're dealing with knowledge today. You know what I'm saying? The Deobandis have a completely different approach. They were preservationists. They were conservationists. You know what I'm saying? Their whole organization is conservative as a strategy of resistance. But how many of them understand that is a strategy of resistance? The ulama of Mauritania, they retreated into the desert in oppositions to the French.
Yep.
Muhammad Abdu, who had taken over Egypt scholarship for a while, Egyptian scholarship, he went to Europe and he wanted the Muslims not to be behind. So Muhammad Abdu is named as a modernist, but Muhammad Abdu was trying to save the Muslims from falling into stagnation and backwardness, and he made mistakes. But if you understand that orientation had an openness to the world versus we're going to close ourselves off to history and preserve the past, he said, no, we're going to open up and try to figure out how to work out our situation. And so when we look at those things, we get a deep understanding. And so that's how the scholars of Al-Azhar, they taught us. You know what I'm saying? And it's very much similar to what you find in some instances in the Western University. And it was not something that they were colonized in, but it's part of the methodology because history is a discipline.
I think that was a perfect conclusion. I don't want to taint it by adding anything.
Well, at least you can make dua for us, inshallah.
You make the dua for us, not my dua. No.
We ask Allah to forgive us and to guide us and to bless, especially in this time period. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to unite our hearts, and that we have eyes and hearts to be able to understand from our past, and to be able to take those lessons which will allow us to preserve ourselves in this world and the hereafter. And we ask Allah by all of His names, and we send salawat on the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, bro. Till the next time,
Thank
let's
you for
do
the
this
blessing.
again, inshallah, and say Assalamu alaikum to the children. I saw pictures of them. They look big, bro.
MashaAllah, they're growing. Alhamdulillah.
Time is not waiting for us.
That's right. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, inshallah. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.